Okay, second lecture, same walk. I'm still heading uphill, deeper into Somerville. Okay, this talk is going to be about Scheman's characterization of what feminist epistemology is. So there's two general factors, and then there's four further things, further aspects of it. But the first general factor she says is that no discussion of knowledge can effectively take place in abstraction from social and political factors. She says neither the descriptive nor the normative task of epistemology can proceed without attention to politics and identity. So just briefly, what is the descriptive versus the normative task? The descriptive task is sort of like describes how we actually act, tells us what we do, tells us what knowledge is, what rationality is, describes those things. Normative aspect tells us what we should do. In some ways they're connected, but how should we go about doing things in order to gain knowledge? How should a rational person act? So the two are connected in the sense that, like, what is rationality has normative implications. So you describe what it is, it tells you what you should do. So they're not completely distinct, but you can still split hairs, and that's what we like to do here in philosophy. So the first one is you can't ignore the identities of people and their historical material incarnations or something. And the second one is that you can't ignore the existence of commitments that are tied to these historical ideological frameworks. That means like beliefs, theories. That's like what I was saying in the last lectures about code, about a critical lens. That means applying the tools that you use to analyze racism and sexism and intersectional oppressions and stuff, and applying those tools to the creation of theories and the proliferation of ideas. So you want to interrogate the theories that are presupposed, or these commitments that people have, in light of what we know about social hierarchies and the material conditions under which we live, especially disparities. Okay, so those are like the general guiding principles, but then she goes into these four specific ways of that feminist epistemology is different from classical epistemology. I should also mention that what Scheman is doing is she's characterizing a literature. I put this in the slide. So it's not necessarily like it's a single view. There's a whole collection of views, different feminist philosophers trying to explain things in different ways. And basically no two philosophers agree about anything. So even among a camp of feminist philosophers, group that is largely aligned politically and theoretically in some sense, there's differences of opinion. So it's not like this is the one and only view, or like the gospel or something of feminist epistemology. Okay, so the first thing she says is anti-individualism. Whenever you hear a term like anti-individualism, the first thing to ask is like, well, what's individualism then? So it's a sort of oppositional view. Individualism is the view that the right unit of analysis is the individual, a single person, single mind, and that justification is explained in terms of what an individual is justified in believing. If there's like such a thing as groups being justified, that just reduces to individuals being justified in believing things. And what knowledge is it's a state of an individual. It's not a state of a group, a state of a collective. So anti-individualism, really a collection of views here. Anti-individualism of the epistemic agent. One version would be to say, like, individuals aren't knowers in themselves. Their communities are the knowers, and a person knows sort of derivatively from being part of a community. Or it might be a different kind of view where the individual is the bearer of knowledge, the thing that knows is the person, but that knowing is sort of relativized to a group, or the justification is sort of relativized to a group, or in some sense that justification is like crucially tied to relationships with other people in a community or something like that. So it's anti-individualist in the sense that the idea is you can't explain what it is for a person to know something or to be justified without paying a lot of attention to social relationships. Not individualist in that sense. I think in its least extreme form, it's very plausible that in order to do a sort of naturalistic analysis of how people come to know things, a huge amount of our knowledge is obtained and sustained in the midst of networks of social relationships with people. And one way that Scheman puts it is it's a mistake to conceive of the epistemic agent as this solitary mind that's weighing reasons for and against things in total abstraction from the community in which they live. But rather, their whole thought process is really bound up with social conventions and the culture that they're in. You might even think about like the way that language works, or the way that thought gets its content. The meaningfulness of your thoughts and speech acts is dependent in some ways on relationships with other people in the community. So what your words mean is pretty straightforwardly, seemingly anyway, has something to do with how people in your community use words. So if your understanding is closely tied to your ability to use language, then there's a straightforward way in which you can see that the social community is tied to our thought processes, especially if social relationships are implicated in meaning creation in the semantics of language. Gives our sentences their truth conditions. So yeah. All right, the second point, which is related but distinct, is that we should not be abstracting away from social identities. So when we think about an agent, we have to think about them as a woman, or as a person of color, as a trans person, whatever they might be, as a cis person, as a man. There's a relevant features. This is to say that the features are relevant, that we shouldn't abstract away from them. So she says that abstracting away from the features, the contingent features of a person's social life, can only be relevant insofar as there's something in common that we all share. We're going to come back to this later when we do Anthony, because you might think that there are certain things that we all share, like having a brain of a certain kind of, structure, and we have certain kinds of abilities given by our biological essence or something like that, if we have such a thing. So one place to push back against this view is to say there are things that we all have in common, and those are an important domain of epistemology. Now, it would be something further to say that's all that epistemology should be doing. So I think even conceding that there are commonalities that we can abstract about and say across all humans it's like this, that doesn't entail that our unique differences or our contingent social identities or cultures or whatever have no effect on how that system operates or how justification works. She says by ignoring the diversity of epistemic agents, we run the risk of generalizing our own circumstances to be the universal, and we risk ignoring perspectives that are different from our own. And those are two of the features that you see in the generic man epistemology. So when you have the generic man, it turns out that the people who have created the generic man epistemology have mostly just been presenting, at least on her view, have been just presenting the situated viewpoint of a certain group of people. So it's almost as if, like, to count as generic, you have to have features in common with this generic person, namely. Someone might also respond or argue that basically you can take the classical epistemology, Russell or something, and you just have to add in more details to accommodate the sort of non-generic people. I think that the issue that Scheman and Code also has with that, sort of on its face, sounds, I already said it, but sort of you treat a bunch of people as non-generic, and then you have to explain how those people fit into the paradigm cases. Or you have to sort of work. So Scheman has this quote from Maria Lugones that says, when I don't see diversity built into the framework, into the structure of the theory, I know I'm going to have to do a lot of mental gymnastics to make this theory do any work in my own life. So if it's not designed for a person outside the generic norm, then it's going to, maybe it can be made to work for other types of people, but it's going to take some work to sort of reconfigure and recalibrate it, and it might not be as effective. And in any case, then the idea is that the epistemologist who's a feminist epistemologist goes right for building diversity into the view. So one big consequence, and I think it's an important thing to note, I think she's right about this, is that once you take on board this imperative that you have to stop abstracting away from personal identity when doing epistemology, it leads to the politicization of epistemology itself. So anytime that you find an epistemology that's framed as if it's apolitical, there's an immediate suspicion. It's connected with this idea of a hermeneutics of suspicion. Anytime you're interpreting a theory that claims to be politically neutral, you should be suspicious that it's actually not politically neutral and it's building in a bunch of biases, cultural biases, or assumptions that are endemic to a certain social identity or class or something. So everything turns out to be, all knowledge claims, science claims, they're all parts of, they have epistemological theories backing them up. So every knowledge claim then is politicized. And you can't do responsible epistemology, responsible science criticism, responsible news reading without incorporating, without having one eye on the politics. And I'm sure that some people are like sick of this now. This phenomenon where we are all doing this, I think, pretty consistently in this day and age. Every news story and every political dust-up has smacks of this, like, who produced it and why, hermeneutics of suspicion. And so I think people have blamed the sort of postmodernist, feminist epistemologist types for causing this scenario. I'm not sure exactly how the story is supposed to go. With like a bunch of radical leftists theorized about the way in which all knowledge is politically laden, and then ultra conservatives got a hold of it or something, and then started using post-truth politics and post-truth strategies or something like that. So even if the causal story did go that way, I still think it's not clear that we can just ignore how do you go back, in other words? In other words, once you notice that epistemology is politicized, it doesn't help to give further epistemological justifications for adhering to some form of objectivity, because those are just seen as further political moves. And that's just how it was always sort of perceived. Any attempt to invoke the concept of objectivity is itself a political move and has a political agenda. Even if the agenda is, I'm just trying to get at a objective notion of rationality, that's always open to the charge of, like, who are you to say what is an objective rationality? And is your theory not at least under suspicion for recapitulating your own cultural biases and your own political agenda, the background assumptions that make your worldview make more sense than the next person's? So this leads us right into the third point. The third thing is accounting for objectivity. Like, what are we supposed to do about objectivity? How can we recover a notion of objectivity? Is there such a thing? So what is objectivity supposed to be after we realize that everyone is trapped to some extent in their own political worldview, that there's no way to legitimately extract yourself from your upbringing, your identity, your culture? One thing that Scheman points out right off the bat, which I think is really important to see, is that feminists are not interested in defending, for the most part, they don't want to defend relativism. They see that relativism is problematic in a bunch of ways. So they're not happily saying there's no objective reality, because this is to quote from a different paper we didn't read, but Sandra Harding in her paper Strong Objectivity says, it's an objective fact that women's uteruses don't swim around in their bodies and make them bad at math. And likewise, feminists want to say, it's an objective truth that women are oppressed by men, generically speaking, and that there are structures of oppression that exist, that racism exists. So these are things that are objectively true on the feminist worldview. So a full-on relativism is not what they're looking for. Scheman also gives this immediate, it's kind of a tu quoque argument, but she says that the struggles with subjectivity versus objectivity are not unique to feminist theory. They've been around since, forever, but especially since people started, whenever it is in whatever cultures, but specifically really in the West, she's talking about that the she calls it the liberalization of epistemology, the idea that authority figures don't have more capacity for knowledge than you average people. And so once you have a population in which everyone is licensed to be a full-fledged rational knower, differences of perspective come up, and you're faced with the question, like, how do you resolve differences of opinion? So she's saying, even for like the sort of classical liberalist rationalist, you have the same problem. So it's not, in other words, the point is, it's not fair to say, you feminist epistemologists are saddling us with this problem of how do we obtain objectivity. It's always been a problem. She says it's not that every single norm is oppressive, not every epistemological practice is not on the same footing. There are better and worse things that you could be doing to know the truth. And as I mentioned in the last video series, I think you can also recognize that saying that our epistemic access to reality is limited by political factors is not the same thing as saying that there is no objective reality out there, that there's no truth independent of human opinions, or that your truth is relative to you and mine is relative to me, and that there's no shared reality we live in. None of that follows from the principle that says we cannot assume a politically neutral position when we're dealing with knowledge claims and rationality and stuff. So what do we do to obtain more objectivity if we can't get absolute objectivity? This is the similar answer that Code gives. The idea is we need to just pay attention to the institutions that produce knowledge, pay attention to the practices that we license as good, rational ways of thinking, and scrutinize them to try to identify ways in which social identity biases and politics are secretly infiltrating those norms, and work to get them out. And it might be that, we can't ever know with absolute objective certainty which norms are problematic, because even the assessment of which norms are problematic and which ones are good, that's going to be situated and it's going to have political biases built into it. So like if you're a feminist and you're analyzing the norms of knowledge, or like the institutions, like the scientific institutions or whatever it might be that produces knowledge for us, the media, your assessment of what are good practices and what's rational, whatever it might be, is going to be laden with your own background assumptions. So you can't get outside of that system, that net of constraints. You can never get fully objective. But I think that the point of the feminist philosopher anyway, and I said this in the last series too, is that we just are in that situation. And it doesn't help to be idealistic where the reality is that we cannot escape some degree of our social imbrocation, and the way that impacts our ability to know. Okay, that is the end of the second part. I'm going to go home and sit on my balcony to do some of the third part. Maybe I'll set out again for a little bit more of a walk at the end of that lecture. I need a little rest. See you in part 3.